She rode into his yard with blood on her hands and her dead father's name on her lips, and she didn't beg. She looked that mountain man straight in the eye and said, "Marry me or I lose everything by Friday." Ethan Walker hadn't spoken to a woman in 2 years. He hadn't wanted to. But something in the way she didn't cry, something in the way her hands shook and her chin stayed up, made him set down his axe. If this story moves you, subscribe and leave your city below. Let's see how far this ride takes us. The axe came down hard. Ethan Walker split the log clean through, tossed both halves aside, and reached for the next one without looking up. He had 17 more to get through before the sun dropped behind the ridge, and he didn't intend to waste a single hour of good daylight. That was how he lived out here 12 miles from the nearest town, and a lifetime from the nearest person who mattered. One task at a time. One day at a time. No complications. No people. No promises he couldn't keep. He was halfway through the pile when his horse, a big gray named Colt, threw his head up and pricked both ears toward the southern trail. Ethan stopped. He set the axe head down in the dirt and listened. Hoofbeats. Coming fast. Too fast for the kind of rocky switchback that wound up from the valley floor. Whoever was riding that trail either didn't know the terrain or didn't care. He picked up the axe again, not to split wood. She came around the bend at a dead gallop, a brown mare with lathered flanks and wild eyes, and the woman on her back wasn't so much riding as she was holding on. Her dress was the color of dried wheat, coated in trail dust from the collar down. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and flew behind her like something trying to escape. She had both hands wrapped around the reins so tight that even from 30 yards Ethan could see the leather cutting into her palms. She pulled the mare up hard in front of his fence line. The horse stumbled, caught herself, stood there breathing like a bellows, sides heaving, head dropping. The woman didn't drop. She straightened in the saddle, lifted her chin, and looked directly at Ethan Walker with eyes that were red at the rims but dry. She had been crying. She wasn't anymore. Whatever had burned through her on that ride up the mountain, she had already decided it was finished. "Are you Ethan Walker?" she said. Her voice was steady, barely. "Depends," he said, "on who's asking. My name is Claire Bennett." She swung down from the saddle without waiting for an invitation, landed in the dirt, and walked right up to the fence post like she owned the ground between them. Up close, her hands were worse than he'd thought. One palm had a dark line of dried blood where the leather had bitten through. She didn't look at it. "My father was Roy Bennett. He died 6 days ago. He left me his ranch, 40 acres on the South Fork of Redstone Creek, a house, a barn, 2 horses, and 8 head of cattle. Sorry for your loss," Ethan said. "I don't need your sympathy." She met his eyes without flinching. "I need your name." He studied her for a long moment, took in the set of her jaw, the way she planted her feet like she expected the ground to try and throw her. The fact that she was standing on his property 12 miles from town in the middle of July with blood on her hands, and she still hadn't looked away from him once. "You already know my name," he said. "You asked for me by name when you rode up." Something crossed her face. Not embarrassment. Closer to impatience. "Then you know what I mean. I need it legally. On paper." She paused, just one breath. "I need you to marry me, Mr. Walker. Before Friday." The words landed flat in the heat between them. A hawk circled somewhere above the tree line. Colt shifted his weight and stamped a fly off his leg. Somewhere down the trail, a pine cone cracked off a branch and hit the ground. Ethan set the axe against the fence post. "Come inside," he said. "Your horse needs water. Sounds like you do too." She sat at his table and didn't touch the cup he set in front of her for nearly a full minute. Her eyes moved around the cabin, the single room, the narrow cot, the rifle over the door, the stack of books on the shelf that she clearly hadn't expected, and then she settled her gaze back on the table and seemed to make a decision about something. She picked up the cup and drank. "Charles Whitmore," she said when she set it down. Ethan didn't sit. He leaned against the wall near the window and crossed his arms and waited. "He's the largest cattle operator in Ridgeline County," she said. Owns most of the grazing land south of town, 3 businesses on Main Street, and the ear of every judge and sheriff this side of the territorial line. Her voice was flat and precise, the way a person talks when they've rehearsed the words enough times that the emotion has worn smooth on them. He wanted my father's land for the water access. The South Fork of Redstone Creek runs straight through our property. Without it, his southern pastures go dry by August. I know who Whitmore is, Ethan said. She looked up. Then you know what he does to people who get in his way. I've heard. He started the week after my father's funeral. She set her palms flat on the table, and he saw her wince slightly when the left one pressed down. First it was an offer, reasonable enough on the surface. I said no. Then it was a lawyer with a document claiming my father owed him a debt, $400, supposedly borrowed 3 years ago. My father never told me about any debt, and the signature on that paper doesn't look right to me. But it's been filed with the county clerk, and unless I can produce proof otherwise, the court will uphold it. $400 is more than the land is worth, Ethan said. He doesn't want the money, she said. He wants the land. The debt is just the vehicle. If I can't pay by Friday, the court will order a lien against the property, and Whitmore's lawyer will move to collect within the week. She looked at him directly. There's a provision in territorial law. A married woman's property cannot be seized for a debt incurred by her father unless the husband consents. If I'm legally married before Friday, the lien can't touch the ranch. And every man in town knows that, Ethan said. Yes. Which is why no one in town will marry you. Something moved behind her eyes. It wasn't pain exactly. It was the particular weariness of a person who has confirmed a thing they already knew. I went to 4 men, she said. Men I've known my whole life. Men who sat at my father's table and shook his hand and said they were his friends. She stopped, pressed her lips together once, continued. The first one said he was sorry, but he didn't want the trouble. The second one offered to marry me if I signed the deed over to him first. The third one told me I ought to just sell to Whitmore and be done with it, take the money and go somewhere else, start over. She paused. The fourth one laughed. The cabin was quiet. Why me? Ethan said. Because you don't belong to this town? She said. You don't owe Whitmore anything. You don't want my land. You have your own place such as it is. Her eyes moved briefly pointedly around the one-room cabin, then back to him. And because Ruth Calloway at the general store said you were the most honest man she'd known in 30 years of doing business, and that if anybody would help me, it would be you, and that you'd either say yes or say no, and you wouldn't pretend. Ruth Calloway. He hadn't spoken to Ruth in 8 months. He hadn't known she thought anything about him at all. This is a business arrangement, Claire said. I'm not asking for anything else. I have 40 acres and I know how to work them. Once the legal matter is settled, once the lien is dismissed, you can go back to your mountain and I'll go back to my ranch, and we don't ever have to see each other again if that's what you want. I'm not asking you to give up your life. I'm asking you to give me 4 days. Ethan looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away. He pushed off the wall and walked to the shelf and stood there with his back to her and his hands loose at his sides, and he thought about Roy Bennett, who he'd met exactly once 3 years ago at a cattle auction in Ridgeline. A quiet man, fair-eyed. He'd offered Ethan a fair price for 2 steers and hadn't tried to talk him down, and when they shook hands, Roy Bennett's grip had been the grip of a man who meant what he said. He thought about Charles Whitmore, who he'd met exactly never, but whose name had followed him like a smell for 2 years. Whitmore's men had run a homesteader named Grady Pitts off his land the spring before last. Grady Pitts was 53 years old, had farmed that same plot since before Montana was a territory, and he'd died the following winter in a rooming house in Billings, broke and alone. Ethan knew that story because Grady Pitts had been the closest thing he'd had to a neighbor. He turned around. I'll need to see the deed, he said, and the debt document. Claire Bennett reached into the front of her dress and pulled out a folded envelope. She set it on the table, without a word. He read everything twice. The deed was clean. Roy Bennett's name, Roy Bennett's land, legally recorded, no encumbrances aside from the contested debt. The signature on the debt document was wrong. He was no expert, but even he could see that the R in Roy curved the wrong way, and the T in Bennett crossed too high. It was a forgery, not a careful one. The kind a man makes when he doesn't expect to be challenged. "This is a fake," he said. "I know it is. You need a lawyer." "I can't afford a lawyer, not a real one, not before Friday." She folded her hands on the table. "I can barely afford the filing fee. My father put everything back into the land every year. There's almost nothing in savings. What I have is the ranch itself, and if Whitmore takes it, I have nothing." Ethan set the papers down and looked at her. She was 28 years old, he guessed, maybe a year or two either side of it. Her face was the kind that had been pretty first, and then become something more than that, something with structure and will behind it that pretty alone doesn't account for. She was exhausted. She was frightened. She was doing an extraordinary job of not showing either. "If I marry you," he said, "and the lien gets dismissed, what then? Whitmore doesn't stop because he lost a court filing." "No," she agreed. "He won't. He'll find another way to come at you. Probably. And you'll be alone out there on that ranch." "I've been alone on that ranch my whole life, Mr. Walker. My mother died when I was 9. I've worked that land alongside my father since I was old enough to lift a fence post. I'm not afraid of hard work or hard weather." She met his eyes. "I'm afraid of losing the only home I've ever known to a man who never worked an honest day in his life, who's bought every sheriff and judge in this county, and who thinks a woman alone is an easy target." The steadiness in her voice cracked, just slightly at the end, and she closed her mouth and pressed it flat again. "I need 4 days. Just 4 days." Ethan picked up his hat from the table, set it back on his head. "My horse needs an hour's rest before we ride back down," he said. "But if we leave by 3, we can make the county clerk's office before it closes." She stared at him. "Unless," he said, "you'd rather wait until morning." "No." She was on her feet. "No, 3 o'clock. That's yes. Thank you." Something moved across her face that was not quite relief and not quite collapse, but something in between, the particular look of a person who has been holding up a tremendous weight and has just found unexpectedly that someone else has put a hand underneath it. She pulled it back quickly, straightened her spine. "I'll see to my mare." "There's a trough out by the fence," he said, "and oats in the barn." She nodded and walked to the door, and then stopped with one hand on the frame. Didn't turn around. "I meant what I said," she told the doorway. "I won't ask anything more from you than what we've agreed. You have my word." "Miss Bennett," he said. She turned then. "Your word," he said, "is the only reason I said yes." They rode down the mountain in silence for the first 2 miles. Not the uncomfortable kind of silence. The kind that happens between people who are both thinking hard about something real. The trail was steep and switchbacked and wanted your attention, and the afternoon sun came at them sideways through the pine gaps and turned the dust gold around their horses' feet. She rode well. He noticed that. She sat her mare the way a person sits who has spent their whole life in the saddle. Not elegant, not showy, just deeply and automatically correct, like the horse was simply another part of her body that she happened to have put on that morning. The mare had recovered from her gallop up. She moved steady now. At the bottom of the trail, where it flattened out into the valley road, Claire said, "What made you come down here to the mountain, I mean? Away from everything?" Ethan thought about whether to answer. "People," he said after a moment. She didn't push it. Just nodded like that was enough, like she understood something in the single word that other people might have needed a paragraph to hear. He found he appreciated that. The road to Ridgeline was 7 miles of open valley. The grasses were summer tall, and the mountains stood up blue and clear on 3 sides, and the sky was the particular hard cobalt of a Montana July afternoon that looks almost unreal, like someone painted it too bright. Ethan had lived in this valley for 4 years, and he still thought that sky was the finest thing about it. They were 2 miles from town when she said, "People will talk." "People talk about everything," he said. "They'll say you married me for the land." "They can say what they want." It doesn't bother you what people think. He considered that. I spent a long time caring what people thought, he said. Didn't do me much good. Or them. He kept his eyes on the road. What people think of you is their business. What you actually do is yours. I know why I'm doing this. That's enough for me. She was quiet again. Then, what did you do before the mountain? Worked ranches, he said. A few years here, a few years there. Moved around. He paused. Wyoming, Colorado. Came up here for a season and didn't leave. Why didn't you leave? The sky, he said, and then felt slightly ridiculous, but didn't take it back. She looked up at it, at the hard, impossible blue overhead. Something softened in her face. Not weakness, just a momentary dropping of the guard, and then she looked back at the road. My father loved this valley, she said. He said you could see your whole life clearly from a high meadow on a good day. Everything you'd done, and everything you still wanted to do. She stopped. He died on a Tuesday morning. Just didn't wake up. No warning, no sickness, just gone. I found him when I came in for breakfast. I'm sorry, Ethan said. And this time, he meant it in the full way, not the polite way. She didn't answer. But she didn't close off either. She just let the words sit there between them in the warm afternoon air, and that seemed to be enough. Duck. Ridgeline was a town of 1,100 people, and the particular compressed meanness that gathers in places where everybody knows everything about everybody, and the knowing has curdled over time into judgment. Main Street ran 4 blocks from the livery to the church, with everything a small town needed arranged along it in the neat and slightly suspicious order of people who like things where they put them and don't appreciate being told otherwise. Ethan hadn't been to Ridgeline in 5 months. He noticed the way people on the street stopped when they rode in. The way eyes moved from Claire to him and back. The way Mrs. Harlan, coming out of the dry goods store with a bundle under her arm, actually stopped walking and stood on the boardwalk and stared. Claire sat straight in her saddle and looked directly ahead. Ethan kept his pace, steady, unhurried. He'd learned a long time ago that the way you moved through a hostile place told the place something about what kind of man you were, and he was not the kind of man who moved like he was sorry for himself. They tied the horses in front of the county building and went inside. The clerk was a small man named Ferris, with ink-stained fingers, and the air of someone who had been mildly put upon by life for so long that mild put-uponness had become his natural expression. He looked up when they came in, looked at Claire, looked at Ethan, looked back at Claire. Miss Bennett, he said. Mr. Ferris, she said. I need a marriage license. The clerk's expression went through several rooms of feeling in about 2 seconds. Surprise was first. Then something calculating. Then something that might have been sympathy, but had a sharper edge to it. Is that right? He said. That's right. Today, please. We'll need a witness and a justice of the peace. Justice Halverson is in his office, Ferris said. He wasn't moving yet. His eyes were on Ethan. And you are? Ethan Walker, Ethan said. Walker. Ferris turned the name over like he was checking it for flaws. Mountain Man, up off the Ridgeline South Trail. That's right. Ferris looked back at Claire. Something had shifted in his face now, something that wasn't quite respect, but was its cousin a kind of surprised recalibration. Like he'd expected her to give up and couldn't quite work out where to put this new development. I'll need 2 witnesses, he said after a moment, for a same-day filing. I'll be a witness. The voice came from the doorway behind them. Ethan turned. A woman stood there, late 50s, iron gray hair pinned up neat, the permanent squint of someone who spent most of their life outdoors. She wore a plain brown dress and a look that could have cut glass. Ruth Calloway, she said to Ethan. General store. You've bought feed from me. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'll witness, she said again to Ferris. And I'll go get Jim Haas from the hardware. He'll be the second. She looked at Claire with something that was not pity, and not exactly admiration, but was the particular steadiness of a woman who has watched other women carry hard things and knows what the carrying looks like. "You all right, honey?" Claire's jaw tightened. "I'm fine, Mrs. Calloway." "Good," Ruth said. "Then let's get this done." The ceremony took 11 minutes. Justice Halverson was a man of 70 with a large white mustache and the rumpled dignity of someone who had presided over enough births, deaths, and legal proceedings to have lost his capacity for surprise, but not his capacity for taking things seriously. He read the words from his book in a slow, deliberate voice, without flourish, without haste. Ethan stood beside Claire Bennett in the justice's office, with its smell of old paper and pipe tobacco, and said the words when it was time to say them. His voice was even. His hands were still. Claire said the words too. Her voice was steady all the way through until the last one, when it caught just barely on the word husband. And then she smoothed it over, and it was gone. They didn't have rings. That hadn't been discussed. Halverson noted it in the margin of the record book and said it didn't affect the legality. When it was done, Ruth Calloway signed her name in a strong, confident hand, and Jim Haas, a broad, red-faced man, who kept looking at Ethan with an expression somewhere between sympathy and apology, signed his. Ferris stamped the document. "Filed," he said. Claire let out a breath. Just one. Then she straightened and thanked Justice Halverson and turned toward the door. Ethan followed her out. On the boardwalk in the long, slanting light of the late afternoon, she stopped and stood very still for a moment, with her face turned toward the mountains at the end of the street. Her shoulders were up near her ears. Then they dropped. Then she turned around to face him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, "I suppose we need to decide what happens next." She looked at him directly, practical, businesslike. "The lien hearing is Friday morning. Whitmore's lawyer will contest. I'll need you there." "I'll be there," he said. "After that—" She stopped. Something shifted in her face. The practicality dimmed for just a second, and underneath it he saw the thing she had been keeping behind the wall this whole time. The grief. Fresh and enormous and barely contained. She was 6 days out from finding her father dead in his bed. She had buried him and immediately been descended upon by lawyers and creditors, and men who saw a woman alone as something to be moved through, and she had ridden 12 miles up a mountain and said the words, "Marry me," to a stranger, and she had not broken once. Until right now. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't even tears. It was just a single second of her face telling the truth. Then she put the wall back up. "After that," she said, "we'll figure out the rest." "Miss Bennett," he said, and then corrected himself. "Mrs. Walker." Her eyes went strange at that. He couldn't quite read it. "Your mare is tired," he said. "If you push her back to the ranch tonight, you'll ruin her. Let her rest tonight at the livery. I'll sleep at the hotel." He paused. "We can ride out to your land tomorrow morning, and I can take a look at what you're dealing with. Figure out the best way to handle Friday." She looked at him for a long moment. "You said 4 days," she said. "That's all I asked for." "I know what you asked for," he said. She waited. "You said you needed a husband before Friday," he said. "You didn't say anything about what you needed after that. But from where I stand, you've got a forged debt document, a corrupt land baron with a bought judge, no lawyer, no money, and 40 acres of ranch you're going to have to work alone." He met her eyes. "I'm not real good at doing things halfway." Ruth Calloway's store was directly across the street. Through the window, Ethan could see her watching them through the glass, pretending to arrange a display. "Why?" Claire said. Her voice was quieter now. Not soft, sharper, actually. The kind of question that wants a real answer, not a polite one. "Why does it matter to you? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." He thought about Grady Pitts dead in a Billings rooming house. He thought about Roy Bennett's handshake at a cattle auction, honest and clean. He thought about the way she'd ridden up his mountain trail at a dead gallop with blood on her hands and her chin up. "Because somebody should," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The sun was getting low, and it caught the dust in the air between them and turned it copper. Then she nodded. Once. Final. "The liveryman's name is Cooper," she said. "He'll give you a fair rate." She turned and started down the boardwalk. 3 steps, and she stopped, and without looking back. "Thank you, Mr. Walker." "Ethan," he said. A pause. "Thank you, Ethan," she said. And she walked down the street with her spine straight and her head up in her dusty dress with her torn palms, and the people who had watched her come in watched her go, and not one of them said a word. Ethan stood on the boardwalk and watched her until she turned the corner. Then he looked up at the sky, the last of that hard, impossible blue. Going amber now at the edges, the mountains going purple at the top. And he thought that whatever he'd ridden down the mountain for this morning, it hadn't been this. But here he was, and for the first time in a long time, he was not entirely sure that was a bad thing. Cooper at the livery charged fare as Claire had promised, and didn't ask a single question about the horse or the woman who'd brought her in, which Ethan appreciated more than he could say. He paid for 2 nights, arranged a stall for Colt beside Claire's mare, and walked to the hotel on the corner of Main and 2nd, with his saddlebag over one shoulder, and the particular feeling of a man who has made a decision he can't quite explain yet, but doesn't regret. The hotel room was small and hot, and smelled like cedar and old soap. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while, and looked at the wall, and thought about what he'd done. He'd gotten married. He turned that over in his mind a few times, the way you turn a stone over to see what's living under it. Married. To a woman he'd known for 6 hours. A woman with 40 acres of forged debt and a powerful enemy who had already bought half the county. He'd done stupider things. He just couldn't remember when. He pulled his boots off and lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling and was asleep in 4 minutes. He was up before the sun. He had the horses saddled and was waiting in front of the hotel when Claire came down the street at 6:30 with her hair pinned back up and her dress shaken out and her boots resoled at some point in the night. She looked like a woman who had slept badly and intended to pretend otherwise, and she walked like someone who had a list of things to do and was already running through it. She stopped when she saw him. Looked at the horses. Looked at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Horses don't saddle themselves," he said. Something almost moved in her face. She took Maple's reins, that was the mare's name he'd learned from Cooper, and swung up without assistance, and pointed her nose south. They rode out of Ridgeline as the sky went pale gold over the eastern ridgeline, the town still quiet around them, the dust of Main Street undisturbed. Nobody to watch them go. Nobody to comment. Just the 2 of them and the open road and the particular clean weight of an early summer morning before the heat settled in. She talked on the ride out. Not nervously, practically. She told him about the ranch, the way a person talks about something they know inside and out, every detail, placed with the precision of someone who has thought about it a great deal. The south pasture needed fencing repaired. The barn roof had a slow leak over the east corner. The creek ran clean, but one of the diversion channels had silted up and needed clearing before the end of the month. 2 of the 8 cattle were hers from a calf she'd raised herself. The rest had been her father's, bought at spring auction. He listened without interrupting. He asked one question about the water rights, and she answered it in precise detail, the original claim, the date of filing, what the territorial records showed. She had it all in her head, every word of it. The daughter of a man who'd built something careful and small and honest, and knew it could be taken, so she'd memorized every legal fact about it like a prayer. "You know more about that property than most lawyers know about anything," he said. "I've had reason to learn," she said. "Whitmore's been circling that land for 2 years. My father knew it. He started teaching me the records the year before he died." Her hands tightened briefly on the reins. "I think he knew he wasn't going to be here to defend it himself." Ethan looked at the road ahead and didn't say anything to that. Some things don't need a response. They just need to be heard. Bar. The Bennett Ranch sat on a long south-facing slope above the creek, and the moment Ethan rode through the gate, he understood why Whitmore wanted it. The land was good. Genuinely. Demonstrably good. The kind of ground that showed what it was in the color of the grass, and the straightness of the trees along the water, and the way the morning light sat on it like it intended to stay. 40 acres wasn't big, But it was well watered and well positioned, and it fed the creek downstream that fed Whitmore's southern pastures. A man could get a lot done with this land. A man could build something here. Claire was already down from her horse and moving toward the barn, and he followed her in, and they spent the first 2 hours of the morning doing the work that needed doing, feeding the cattle, checking the fence line along the east pasture, looking at the barn roof. She handed him tools when he needed them without being asked. She knew where everything was, knew which boards needed replacing and which could hold another season, knew the temperament of each animal. She worked hard, real hard. Not performing hardness, not trying to prove a point. Just the flat, competent labor of a person who has always done this and doesn't know how to stop. Around 8 o'clock she went into the house and came back with 2 tin cups of coffee and a plate of biscuits. And they sat on the fence rail and ate without talking for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. "What time does Whitmore usually send someone?" Ethan said. She looked up from her cup. "What makes you think he sends someone?" "Because a man like that doesn't wait," he said. "He's already filed the document. He's already got his timeline. He'll want to know what you did yesterday, whether you found a lawyer, whether you're planning to contest." He held her eyes. "He'll have someone watching this place." She set her cup down slowly. "Hector Reeves," she said. "He works for Whitmore's lawyer. He's ridden past twice this week. Slow, like he was counting things." "When did he last come by?" 2 days ago." "Then he'll be by today," Ethan said. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, not fear, but a clear-eyed acknowledgement of the thing that was coming. She straightened. "All right," she said. "Then I suppose he should see that things have changed." "Yes," Ethan said. "He should." Hector Reeves arrived at 9:30. Ethan heard the horse on the road before he saw it, and he was still on the fence rail, working a loose post back into the ground with the heel of his boot when Reeves pulled up at the gate. Reeves was a thin man with a pale face and a clerk's hands, and the particular combination of insignificance and petty authority that made up the worst kind of errand boy. He looked at Ethan with the expression of a man whose calculations have just stopped adding up. He looked at the post Ethan was working. He looked at the house. He looked back at Ethan. "Morning," Ethan said. "Morning," Reeves said carefully. "I'm looking for Miss Bennett." "Mrs. Walker," Claire said, coming around the corner of the barn. She had a bucket in one hand and she set it down on the ground and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Reeves with the calm of a woman who had already made every decision she needed to make. "Can I help you?" Reeves's pale face went through several calculations. "Mrs. Walker," he repeated. "That's right." Reeves looked at Ethan again. "And you would be—" "Her husband," Ethan said. He didn't move from the fence rail, didn't look up from the post. "You got business here, mister, or you just passing through?" A silence stretched out between them, taut as a wire. "I know," Reeves said after a moment. "No business. Good day." He turned his horse around and went back down the road at a speed that was not quite a run, but was as close to one as dignity allowed. Claire watched him go. When he was out of sight, she let out a slow breath. "He'll go straight to Whitmore," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "He will." She turned and looked at him, and for a moment, something crossed her face that she didn't immediately put away, something like the beginning of trust, not the full thing yet, but the place where it starts. Then she picked up her bucket and went back to work. By mid-morning the word had gotten back to town. Ethan knew this the way you know weather is coming, not because you can see it yet, but because the air changes. A hand from the neighboring spread a man named Doherty came by around 11 with a thin excuse about borrowing a post-hole digger. He spent 10 minutes pretending to look at the tool, and the whole time his eyes were on Ethan with the fascinated, slightly stunned expression of a man hearing a story he didn't expect. He left without the digger. Then Ruth Calloway's nephew showed up with a delivery that Claire hadn't ordered a side of salt pork and a paper sack of flour, and Ruth had written a note in the margin of the receipt that said only, "People are talking." You did right. R. And then just before noon, a man came that Ethan had not anticipated. His name was Dale Sutter, and he was Claire's nearest neighbor, a rancher of about 60, with a weathered face and honest eyes, and the kind of slowness of movement that belongs to men who have survived a great deal by not wasting energy. He tied his horse at the gate and came up the path with his hat in his hands, and stopped a respectful distance from where Claire was working near the porch. "Miss Claire," he said, then caught himself. "Pardon, Mrs. Walker." "Mr. Sutter," she said. He turned the hat in his hands. "I heard what you did." He glanced at Ethan, acknowledged him with a nod. "I want you to know your daddy was a good man. And what Whitmore's been doing to this valley, it ain't right. I know it, and most folks know it. They're just—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "I should have helped you sooner. I'm ashamed I didn't." Claire was very still. "I'm telling you now," Sutter said, "that if you need a witness at that hearing Friday, you got one. And if you need a man to speak to what Roy Bennett was the kind of man he was, his word and his character, I'll stand up in that room and say it. Whatever good it does." The hat went around in his hands twice more. Claire walked over to him. She put her hand out and he shook it, and whatever she said to him Ethan couldn't hear, but it made Sutter's jaw go tight with something that looked like relief. He put his hat back on, nodded to Ethan once more, and walked back to his horse. After he left, Claire stood where she was for a moment with her back to Ethan. Her shoulders were very straight. He could see her breathing. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." The word came out rough at the edges. She turned around, and her face was controlled, but her eyes were bright. "He was my father's oldest friend. They came to this valley the same year." She stopped. "He didn't come to the funeral." Ethan looked at her. "I know why," she said. "Whitmore's men were there, watching who came, making notes. Sutter's got his own land to protect." She pulled in a breath. "I understand it. I do. But it's one thing to understand something and another thing to—" She stopped again, looked away. Her jaw worked once. "It matters," Ethan said quietly. "That he came." She looked at him. Something in her face went softer for just a second, and then she nodded once, like she was filing the thought away somewhere important. "It matters," she said. That afternoon they found the notice. It was nailed to the fence post at the south gate, a piece of white paper folded once with the words, "Final Notice of Debt Collection," printed across the top in the officious block letters of a man who has access to a lawyer and enjoys using him. Below the header, in smaller text, a full restatement of the alleged debt. Roy Bennett's forged signature, reproduced in neat facsimile, and at the bottom, the deadline, Friday, July 18th, 1885, 9 a.m., and the name of Whitmore's law firm. Claire read it without touching it. Her face was flat and closed. Then she reached up and pulled it off the post with one sharp motion, folded it twice more, and tucked it in her apron pocket. "He's escalating," she said. "He got the news from Reeves," Ethan said. "He didn't expect this. He's trying to rattle you." "Is it working?" she said. "Is it—" She looked at him directly. "No," she said. "Then don't let it," he said. She nodded. And something shifted. Something small but definite, the way a weight shifts when a second person puts their hand under it. The determination in her face didn't grow exactly, but it settled the way a flame settles when the wind stops pulling at it. They walked back toward the barn together, and that evening they sat at Roy Bennett's kitchen table and went through every document she had. The deed, the water rights filing, the original homestead claim, 3 years of purchase receipts for feed and tools and livestock. Ethan went through them slowly and methodically, and Claire sat across from him and answered every question he asked. And after 2 hours, he sat back in his chair and looked at the pile and said, "The signature on that debt note is wrong in 3 places. I'm not a document examiner, but I can see it, and so can anyone who looks." "Whitmore's judge won't look," she said. "No," he agreed, "but a territorial court would." She met his eyes. "We don't have a territorial court." "Not yet," he said. She studied him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if a man has been forging documents to steal land from ranchers in this county, Roy Bennett isn't the only one. He tapped the paper. Sutter's here tomorrow. When he comes, I want to ask him something. What? Whether anyone else in this valley has gotten a notice like this one. Whether any other land has changed hands in the last 2 years under similar circumstances. He looked at her. Because if Whitmore's been running this same scheme across the county, the people he's done it to might be the evidence we need. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, my father said something to me about a year before he died. He said there were 3 ranchers south of town who had sold to Whitmore's intermediaries under pressure. He thought the prices were too low and the timing was wrong. He said it felt like something was being worked. She paused. He tried to ask around. People were scared. They're still scared, Ethan said. But scared and willing are 2 different things, and sometimes all it takes is one person standing up. She looked at him across the table. The oil lamp between them. The papers spread out Roy Bennett's handwriting on the deed that still said her name on it. Her land, her father's dream. Why are you still here? She said. Not hostile, genuine. The question of a woman trying to understand something she hasn't been able to account for. Ethan looked at the lamp for a moment. I told you why, he said. You said because somebody should. She tilted her head slightly. That's not an answer. That's a principle. I want to know why you. He was quiet for a long moment. I knew a man named Grady Pitts, he said finally. Homesteader. Farmed a piece of ground a few miles from my place, had been there longer than most. Whitmore's men came at him 2 winters ago. Not Whitmore himself, never Whitmore himself. Just men with papers and lawyers' letters and a story about a debt. He looked at her. Grady didn't have anyone. He was old and he was alone, and he didn't know how to fight what they were doing, and by the time he figured it out, they'd already moved the legal pieces into place, and there was nothing left to do. He paused. He died the following winter in a rooming house in Billings. I found out through a man who'd known him. Nobody came to claim his things. Claire was very still. I didn't help him, Ethan said. I didn't know what was happening until it was already over. And then I told myself there was nothing I could have done, and for a while I believed that. He met her eyes. I don't believe it anymore. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, somewhere down by the creek, a nighthawk called. I'm not Grady Pitts, she said softly. No, he said. You're not, because you came and asked. He held her gaze. And I'm not the man who looked the other way. They didn't talk much after that. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the kind of understanding that had just moved between them didn't need more words. It had landed where it needed to land. She showed him the spare room, small, clean, a rope bed with a wool blanket that smelled like cedar. Her father's room, she said without elaborating. He nodded and said it was more than fine and meant it. He lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around him. The sounds of a working place at rest, the horses in the barn, the occasional low mutter of cattle in the east pasture, the creek running somewhere below. He'd slept in a lot of places. Bunkhouses, campsites that one winter in a trapper's lean-to north of Missoula when the money had run out and the work had dried up. He'd slept in hotel rooms that smelled like other people's troubles. He'd slept on the ground under more stars than he could count. He couldn't think of a single place where the dark had felt like this. Not threatening, not empty, just present, inhabited. He was still thinking about that when he fell asleep. The next morning, he found her already in the south pasture, working a post-hole digger into the ground with steady, two-handed strokes. The fence line along the south boundary was older than the rest he'd noticed it yesterday, and 3 posts were rotting at the base. She'd brought out the tools and the replacement posts before he was up. He walked down the hill and took the digger from her hands without asking. She looked at him. Let him have it. He drove it into the ground. They worked the fence line for 2 hours in the morning heat, and he learned something about her in those 2 hours that no conversation could have told him as well. She worked with him, not behind him. When he dug, she fitted the post. When she fitted the post, he tamped it. When one of the replacement posts turned out to be the wrong length, she went back to the barn and found the right one without being asked, and came back without comment. She was precise and efficient, and she didn't waste motion, and she didn't make conversation for the sake of it, and she had the particular quality rare in anyone, rarer in the circumstances she was in, of being fully present in whatever she was doing. He found himself noticing things. The way she tucked her chin when she was concentrating on a difficult piece of work. The way she moved her hands when she was explaining something quick, geometric, like she was drawing a map in the air. The way she said thank you to the cattle when she fed them, quiet and automatic. The way a person says something they've always said and doesn't think about it anymore. Around 10 o'clock she said, "Tell me about your ranch, up on the mountain." "Not much to tell," he said. "There's always something to tell," she said. "How many acres?" 60. Most of it's not workable, rock and timber. Cattle. 8, same as you. He paused. Few goats. A dog. She looked at him. "You left a dog up there." "He's got a good head," Ethan said. "He manages." "You left your dog alone on a mountain for," she calculated, 3 days now. "He'll be fine." She gave him a look that was equal parts disbelief and amusement, and it was the first time she'd looked at him like that, not assessing him, not being grateful, not being careful, just reacting to him, one person to another. It lasted about 2 seconds, and then she went back to the fence post. But the 2 seconds stayed with him. Dale Sutter came at noon, as he'd said he would, and he brought something Ethan hadn't asked for, but needed a name. "Frank Alderman," Sutter said, sitting at Claire's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. "Sold his place 2 years ago last spring. Said it was his own choice, said the price was fair, and 3 weeks later he was in Billings and wouldn't talk about it. I always thought—" He stopped. "Frank and I were friends. He wouldn't look at me the last time I saw him." "Where is he now?" Ethan said. "Still in Billings, far as I know. His wife's people are there." Sutter turned the cup in his hands. "You think he'd talk?" "I think a man who can't look his friend in the eye knows something he needs to say," Ethan said. "Whether he'll say it is another question. But if he would—" He looked at Claire. "A living witness who sold under duress is different from a forged document. A judge can choose to look the other way from paper. It's harder when there's a person standing in the room." Claire's hands were flat on the table. "Friday is 2 days away." "I know," Ethan said. "Billings is a 4-hour ride." "I know that too." She looked at him. The question she was asking wasn't the one she was saying out loud. The question she was asking was, "Are you going to do this? Are you actually going to do this?" "I'll leave at first light tomorrow," he said. "If Alderman will come, I can have him back here by Thursday evening. That's enough time to prepare his testimony." Sutter was watching both of them with an expression that belonged to a man witnessing something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure yet how to name. "I'll come with you," Claire said. "No," Ethan said. "The ranch needs to be occupied. If you leave, Whitmore's men could use that claim abandonment move, something tamper with the property. You need to be here and visible." She didn't like it. He could see that. She was not a woman who took well to being told to stay behind, and he understood it, and he wasn't going to pretend he didn't. "This isn't about protecting you from the ride," he said. "It's strategy. You know this land. You know what should be here and what shouldn't. If something changes while I'm gone, you'll know it immediately." He held her eyes. "I need you here. That's different from telling you to stay out of it." A long pause. "All right," she said. The words were even. Reluctant, but even. Sutter finished his coffee and set the cup down. "I can stay nearby," he said. "Keep an eye on the road. I got a hand who's trustworthy. I can put him on the south fence line, so it looks like we've got more presence than we do." "That's good," Ethan said. "That's real good." That evening, while Claire was inside writing a letter, she didn't explain, and he was checking Colt's shoes on the porch. She came to the door and leaned against the frame and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up. "Whitmore came to see me," she said. "Not his lawyer. Him, the day after my father's funeral." Ethan said nothing. Waited. He came to the house and he sat at this table and he was very polite. He said he was sorry for my loss. He said my father had been a respected man. Her voice was flat, but there was something underneath it, something still hot. And then he put his hands on the table, and he said that a woman alone on 40 acres in this valley was going to have a very hard time of it, and that he was prepared to be generous, and that his generosity had a limit. "What did you say?" Ethan said. "I showed him the door," she said. He didn't move for a moment, just looked at me. And then he smiled, not at me, just... She stopped. Like I was a problem he was going to enjoy solving. And then he left. Ethan set down Colt's hoof and straightened up. "You should have told me this yesterday," he said. "I know," she said. "I didn't want it to change the equation." "It doesn't change the equation," he said. "But I need to know what I'm working with." She looked at him steadily. "He's not just going to take the land, Ethan. He's made it personal. I could see it in him. He doesn't like being told no, especially not by a woman alone." She paused. "I want you to know that. Because when you go to Billings tomorrow, there's a chance he does something while you're gone. Something beyond sending Reeves to look at fence posts." "What kind of something?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "That's what worries me." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp from inside threw her shadow across the porch boards. She was standing very straight, and her eyes were direct and clear, and he understood in that moment that she wasn't telling him this to frighten him or to pull him back from going. She was telling him because she thought he deserved to know the full weight of what he'd walked into. That kind of honesty was not common. He'd met it maybe twice in his life before this, and both times it had meant something. "I'm not easy to scare off," he said. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said. "You've got Sutter nearby, and his hand on the fence line. You've got your father's rifle, and you know how to use it, I'd guess." "Better than most," she said. "Then you're not alone," he said. "Whatever he does, you're not alone anymore." Something crossed her face. Not relief. Deeper than that. The particular expression of a person who has spent a very long time carrying something solo and has just unexpectedly been believed. She said quietly, "I'll have coffee ready when you get back." "I'll hold you to that," he said. She went back inside. Ethan stood on the porch a while longer in the warm dark, and somewhere down by the creek, the nighthawk called again, and the stars over Roy Bennett's ranch were thick and clear and very bright. And he thought about a man in Billings named Frank Alderman, who couldn't look his friend in the eye, and he thought about a forged signature with a wrong curved R, and he thought about Charles Whitmore sitting at this same table with his hands flat on the wood, and that smile that wasn't aimed at anyone. He thought, that smile is going to cost him, and he was already thinking about how. Ethan left before the sun was up. He didn't wake Claire. He'd saddled Colt in the dark by feel the way a man does who has done it 10,000 times, and he was through the south gate and on the Billings Road before the sky had gone from black to gray. He rode hard. Not reckless Colt had 60 miles ahead of him, and Ethan knew better than to burn a good horse early, but with the particular focused urgency of a man who has a narrow window and knows exactly how narrow it is. Thursday. One day before the hearing, he had one shot at this. The road to Billings ran through open valley for the first 20 miles, and then climbed through a long pine ridge before dropping into the river basin. He made the ridge by mid-morning and stopped to let Colt drink from a stream crossing and stood there in the early heat and thought about Frank Alderman, a man who wouldn't look his friend in the eye, a man who'd sold his land and moved to Billings and gone quiet. Men went quiet for two reasons in Ethan's experience: because they were ashamed, or because they were afraid. Sometimes both at once, and that was the worst kind of quiet because it had layers to it, and you had to get through all of them before you reached the truth. He mounted back up and kept riding. He found Frank Alderman at a feed supply warehouse on the east side of Billings, loading sacks onto a flatbed wagon with the mechanical steadiness of a man who has simplified his life down to the things he can lift and carry and put down. Alderman was 50, maybe 55, with a face that had been sun-weathered into deep lines, and eyes that had the particular flatness of someone who has stopped expecting things. He looked up when Ethan's shadow crossed the wagon, looked at him without recognition, then back to the sack in his hands. "Frank Alderman," Ethan said. "Who's asking?" "My name's Ethan Walker. I married Claire Bennett 2 days ago, Roy Bennett's daughter." He watched Alderman's hands slow on the sack. "I need to talk to you about how you sold your land." Alderman set the sack down, very carefully, like he was buying time with the motion. "I got nothing to say about that," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm asking anyway." "Mister, I don't know you, and whatever's happening in Ridgeline, I'm not part of it anymore. I got a job here. I got my wife's family nearby. He stopped. Something moved in his jaw. "I got out. That's what I got." "Roy Bennett didn't get out," Ethan said. "He's in the ground, and his daughter is going to lose his land on Friday morning if somebody doesn't stand up and tell the truth about what Charles Whitmore does to people in that valley." Silence. The warehouse around them smelled like grain dust and dry wood, and the particular heaviness of a space where men work without talking much. "They forged your signature too, didn't they?" Ethan said. Not a question. Alderman's face did something complicated. His jaw went tight, and his eyes went to the middle distance, and a muscle in his neck pulled hard. Then he picked up another sack. "I signed my own papers," he said. "Under what circumstances?" Ethan said. "Mister, 2 of Whitmore's men came to your place," Ethan said, "with papers and a lawyer's letter and a story about a debt your family didn't owe. And they sat at your table and they were very polite and very clear about what would happen if you didn't cooperate. And you had a wife and you were thinking about her and you didn't see another way." He kept his voice level, not accusing, just naming the shape of a thing. "And then you signed. And they were satisfied. And you packed up and left, and you have not spoken about it since, because speaking about it means admitting it happened, and admitting it happened means living in that moment again." Alderman had stopped moving entirely. "I'm right," Ethan said. The warehouse was very quiet. "They told me," Alderman said, finally, his voice low and rough, "that if I talked about it, they'd come back. Not for the land. For my wife." He turned and looked at Ethan directly for the first time, and what was in his eyes now wasn't flatness. It was the still burning remnant of something that had been terrifying. "I believe them." "Do you still?" Ethan said. A long pause. "A man who does what Whitmore does to one family," Ethan said, "does it to every family he can. Roy Bennett's daughter is next. She's alone. She's got 40 acres and a forged debt note and a Friday morning deadline. And the only thing standing between her and what happened to you is whether somebody with a first-hand account is willing to walk into a hearing room and say what actually happened." He held Alderman's eyes. "I'm not asking you to be brave for its own sake. I'm telling you that the man who made you afraid is doing it again to someone else, and this time there might be enough people standing together to make it stop." Alderman looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "What time does the hearing start?" They made it back to the Bennett Ranch by 7 Thursday evening. Alderman rode a borrowed roan that Ethan had arranged at the Billings livery, and he rode the whole way in a kind of deliberate silence that wasn't peaceful but wasn't brittle either. It was the silence of a man who has made a hard decision and is sitting with the weight of it, making sure it holds. Claire was on the porch when they rode in. She looked at Alderman, looked at Ethan. Something moved through her face, relief quick and fierce, and then she came down off the porch and shook Alderman's hand and said his name and said she appreciated it, and the way she said it was direct and warm without being sentimental, and Ethan watched Alderman's shoulders drop about an inch when she did. They ate dinner at Roy Bennett's kitchen table, the three of them, and over the meal Alderman told his story. All of it. The men who came, the papers, the specific name of Whitmore's man who had done the talking, a lawyer named Griggs, who worked out of an office on 2nd Street in Ridgeline, and had the distinguished moral character of a man who would sell his mother for a percentage. Claire listened without interrupting. She asked two sharp, precise questions at the end, both about the documents he'd been shown. Alderman answered them. She wrote something in the small notebook she'd taken to carrying in her apron pocket. After Alderman had gone to his room, the same spare room that had been Ethan's, she sat at the table with her notebook open and didn't speak for a moment. "Is it enough?" she said. "His testimony, plus the signature discrepancy, and Sutter as a character witness," Ethan said. "Against Whitmore's lawyer and a bought judge, I don't know. It should be enough. Whether it will be is a different answer." She nodded. She'd already known that. She was asking anyway because sometimes you need to say the uncertain thing out loud to make it real. "There's one more thing," she said. She looked up at him. "Sutter's hand, the one on the south fence line, he came to me this afternoon. He said 2 of Whitmore's men were on the road at the south boundary this morning, watching the place." She paused. "And one of them went to the county clerk's office." Ethan went still. "What for?" he said. "He doesn't know," she said. "But Ferris the clerk sent a message through Cooper at the livery. Ferris said Whitmore's lawyer came in this morning and asked to review the marriage record." Her eyes were steady on his. "And Griggs told Ferris that the marriage was that there were questions about its validity." "On what grounds?" Ethan said. "Griggs claimed you weren't a county resident," she said. "Said your property is outside the county line. Said the license should have been filed in a different jurisdiction." A beat of silence. Ethan thought about that, thought about it carefully. "Is he right?" Claire said. "No," Ethan said. "My property is 12 miles south of the county line, on this side of it. I've paid Ridgeline County taxes for 4 years. He paused. "But Griggs knows that. He looked it up before he made the claim." "Then why?" "Because he's not trying to win that argument," Ethan said. "He's trying to create enough confusion around the marriage that the judge has grounds to question it. If he can get the marriage set aside, the property protection disappears. The lien holds. He doesn't need to prove it. He just needs to muddy the water enough that a sympathetic judge can reach for it." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Then we need Ferris in that room tomorrow," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "Ferris witnessed the filing," she said. "He can confirm the jurisdiction." "Can he be pressured?" Ethan said. "By Whitmore." Claire thought about it. "Ferris is a small man," she said carefully. "Not small in character. I mean, he's a man who values his position and his routine and his sense of order. He does not like being put in difficult positions." She paused. "But he also does not like being made complicit in something that's wrong. When Griggs came in and asked about the marriage record, Ferris sent word to us. He didn't have to do that." "No," Ethan said. "He didn't." They looked at each other across the table and understood something simultaneously, that the people who were going to make the difference tomorrow were not the powerful ones. They were the small ones. The ones who valued doing right more than they valued staying comfortable. Ferris, with his ink-stained fingers. Sutter, with his hat in his hands. Ruth Calloway, writing a note in the margin of a receipt. Alderman loading sacks in Billings, deciding in a grain warehouse whether he could afford to stop running. "We need to be at that courthouse at 8:30, Ethan said. 15 minutes before the hearing starts." "I'll be ready," she said. And he believed her completely. The night before the hearing, Claire didn't sleep. Ethan knew because he didn't either. He could hear the house, the small sounds of it the way a dwelling breathes when the people inside it are awake and still. Around midnight, he got up and walked to the kitchen for water, and found her sitting at the table in the dark, with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she'd clearly forgotten she was holding, and her father's Bible open on the table in front of her, though she didn't appear to be reading it. He sat down across from her. She looked up. In the dark, she looked younger and more tired, and more exactly herself than she looked in daylight when she was always doing something. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. He didn't argue the point. He got up, refilled both their cups from the stovetop, and came back and sat down again. "What was he like?" he said. "Your father." She looked at the Bible. Her hand moved to the cover and rested there without opening it. "Quiet," she said. "Like you." A pause. He didn't say unnecessary things. When he said something, he meant it. Her thumb moved along the edge of the pages. "He used to get up before me every morning and have coffee ready when I came down. He did it my whole life. I didn't think about it until the first morning after he was gone and the coffee wasn't there." She stopped. That was the moment it was real, not the funeral, not the lawyer's letter, just the cold stove and the empty cup. Ethan sat with that. "He would have liked you," she said quietly. Not as a compliment exactly, as an observation. He didn't like many people, but he liked the ones who did what they said. "He sounds like a man worth liking," Ethan said. She looked at him. In the low light, her eyes were very dark. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah, whatever happens tomorrow." She stopped, started again. "I need you to know that whatever happens, what you've done here, coming down from that mountain, going to Billings, staying—" Her voice was steady, but something in it pulled tight at the end. "I've been alone in this for 6 days, and I told myself I could handle it alone, and I could have maybe, but—" She stopped again. Her jaw worked once. "But I didn't have to. And that matters. It matters more than I know how to say." He looked at her across the table with the old Bible between them and Roy Bennett's kitchen around them and the dark outside the windows, and he said the truest thing he could think of. "I know it does." She nodded, just once. And then she closed her hands around the cup, and they sat together in the quiet until the sky started going gray at the edges, and neither of them needed to say anything else. They rode into Ridgeline at 8:20 in the morning. Ethan, Claire, Frank Alderman, and Dale Sutter. 4 horses on the main road. The town was up and moving the way a small town moves when it knows something is happening, that charged slightly breathless quality of people finding reasons to be on Main Street at an unusual hour. They stopped in front of the courthouse, and Ethan helped nobody down, and nobody needed helping, and they walked up the steps together. Ruth Calloway was standing at the top. She had on her best dress and a look on her face that could have leveled timber. Beside her was a younger man Ethan didn't know, and an older woman with a face like pressed linen, the wife of someone clearly not pleased to be here, but here. "Mrs. Calloway," Claire said. "I brought 2 more witnesses," Ruth said without preamble. "Harold Finch, he sold his pasture to Whitmore's man 2 years ago, and he's had it on his conscience since. And Margaret Briggs, whose husband sold the spring rights on their North 40 under what she'll testify was a document he didn't understand and wouldn't have signed if he had." She looked at Claire with the flat directness of a woman who has decided something and implemented it. "I've been working the problem since you rode up that mountain, honey. I just needed to know you had a fighting chance before I asked people to put themselves in the line of fire." Claire looked at Ruth Calloway for a moment with something in her face that was beyond words and didn't try to be them. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Ruth said. "Whitmore's already inside, and he brought Griggs and 2 men from the Territorial Bank." She paused, and her voice dropped just slightly. "And Judge Calloway, no relation before you ask, is the most bought man in the county." Ethan looked at Claire. She looked at him. "Then we'd better get in there," she said. The hearing room was small and smelled like old wood and authority. Judge Calloway sat at the front bench, a large man with a red face and the permanently superior expression of someone who has confused proximity to power with the possession of it. Whitmore's lawyer, Griggs, stood at the right table, thin, precise, expensive-looking, in a way that money buys and character doesn't. 2 men from the Territorial Bank sat to one side with document cases on their laps, and Charles Whitmore sat in the gallery. Ethan had never seen him before. He was not what he'd expected, which was the nature of men like Whitmore. They were rarely what you expected, because the image you'd built from their actions was always bigger and more elemental than the human being. Whitmore was perhaps 60, well-dressed with gray at his temples, and a face that was not cruel in its features, but had cruelty in its arrangement. in the particular way his eyes moved across the room as people entered, assessing, categorizing, already calculating advantage. His eyes went to Claire first, then to Ethan. They stayed there for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like a man adjusting his estimate of a situation he thought he had fully measured. Then he looked away. Griggs opened proceedings with the debt claim. He was good. Ethan had to give him that. He laid it out cleanly, produced the document with Roy Bennett's forged signature, cited the filing date, cited the amount, cited the legal precedent for collection against the property. He was smooth and confident, and moved through the argument the way a man moves through familiar territory. Then he paused, looked at Judge Calloway with a slight shift of expression that communicated a great deal between men who understand each other. "Your Honor," Griggs said, "I would also raise a preliminary matter regarding the validity of the marriage record filed 2 days ago by Miss Bennett, as the property protection claim rests on—" "I'll stop you there, Counselor." The voice came from the back of the room. Every head turned. A man stood in the doorway. He was perhaps 40, trail dusty, with the look of someone who had ridden hard and recently. He carried a leather document case and wore a badge on his coat that caught the light from the window. A federal badge, and Ethan recognized the seal without needing to read the words. United States Territorial Commissioner's Office. Griggs's face went absolutely still. The man walked up the center of the room and placed his document case on the left table and said without raising his voice, "My name is James Rourke. I'm an investigator with the Territorial Commissioner. I've been looking into land transaction irregularities in Ridgeline County for the past 4 months." He opened the case. "I have affidavits, document examinations, and testimony records from 11 parties relating to transactions involving land parcels sold to entities connected to Charles Whitmore between 1882 and 1885. He looked up at Judge Calloway. "I'll be observing these proceedings, Your Honor, and I'd like to add several items to the evidentiary record." Then the room was absolutely silent. Ethan looked at Whitmore. The man's face had not changed. That was the thing about men like him, they'd trained themselves not to show a thing. But his right hand resting on the gallery rail had closed, slowly, the knuckles going light. Griggs recovered first. "Your Honor, the Commissioner's office has no standing in a local debt proceeding. A federal investigation into fraud has standing wherever the fraud occurred, Counselor," Rourke said pleasantly. "I won't argue jurisdiction with you. I'll let the Commissioner's office do that if it comes to it." He sat down and folded his hands on the case. "Please continue." Calloway looked at Griggs. Griggs looked at Calloway. A conversation passed between them in silence that everyone in the room could read perfectly clearly, and the translation was, "This is not what we planned for." Calloway cleared his throat. "We'll proceed with the debt claim," he said. His voice had changed, just slightly, the particular quality of authority slightly loosened from its certainty. Griggs presented the debt document. Ethan stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to submit a document examination." Calloway looked at him. "And you are?" "Ethan Walker. I'm the husband of Claire Walker née Bennett, and I have a legal interest in these proceedings." He walked to the front and set down the comparison he'd prepared the night before Roy Bennett's signature from 3 separate authenticated sources, the deed, the water rights filing a ranch supply receipt from 2 years prior, beside the debt note. The signature on this debt document does not match Roy Bennett's signature as established in these authenticated records. The letter form of the capital R is structurally different. The cross on the T in Bennett is placed at an angle inconsistent with all authenticated examples. I am not a document examiner, but I'd suggest the court is entitled to have one look before ruling. Calloway's red face had gone a shade darker. "This is not a forgery hearing." "No, Your Honor," Rourke said from the back quietly. "But it may become one." Another silence. Griggs shuffled his papers, and then Frank Alderman stood up. He did it slowly, the way a man gets up when he's been sitting with something heavy for a long time and has decided the sitting is finished. He was plain and unremarkable in his borrowed clothes, and his voice was not loud when he said, My name is Frank Alderman. I owned the quarter section on the South Fork. I sold it 2 years ago. He paused. I want to say what actually happened. The room changed. Ethan could feel it, the particular shift that happens when something true is about to be said in a place that has been expecting lies. People sat differently, leaned forward. The woman from the gallery, Margaret Briggs, put her hand over her mouth. Calloway said, "Mr. Alderman, this is not a... Let him speak." Ruth Calloway's voice from the gallery was not loud, and it was not polite, and it landed in the room like a stone landing in still water. Calloway turned red. He looked at Griggs. Griggs was looking at his papers with the expression of a man recalculating a great many things simultaneously. He looked at the federal badge on Rourke's coat. He said, "You may proceed, Mr. Alderman." Alderman told it. The whole thing. The men who came to his door, the papers, the lawyer who sat at his table, he named Griggs clearly and specifically and without hesitation, and Griggs's pen stopped moving on his notepad, the threat against his wife, the signature under duress. He stood and told it with the flat recitative quality of a man who has rehearsed it in his head 10,000 times in 2 years and is finally letting it out of his body, and every word was clear and each one was true. And when he was done, he sat back down, and Harold Finch stood up immediately after him and said, "My name is Harold Finch. The same thing happened to me." And then Margaret Briggs said, "And me." 3 voices. In a small courthouse in Ridgeline, Montana, 3 people who had been afraid for 2 years stood up in the same hour and said the same truth. Whitmore stood up from the gallery. Every eye went to him. He was very composed. His suit was straight and his face was still. He looked at Rourke and he said, "I'd like to speak with my attorney." "Of course," Rourke said. He stood up too. "I'd also suggest speaking with the commissioner's office directly. The 11 affidavits I mentioned include 3 signed depositions from individuals who worked for your legal team and have agreed to full cooperation in exchange for consideration." He paused, and something in his voice went very quiet and very precise, the way a man talks when he is saying the last thing before a door closes. "The commissioner has been building this case for 4 months, Mr. Whitmore. We were waiting for a trigger event, a contested hearing ideally with a living plaintiff who could establish standing for federal fraud review." He picked up his document case. "I'd like to thank Mrs. Walker for providing one." Ben. Claire was sitting absolutely still at the left table. She didn't look at Whitmore. She was looking at her hands flat on the table, and something was moving through her face that she was letting move. She wasn't putting the wall up, wasn't controlling it, just letting it happen. Her father's land, her father's name, the forged signature on a piece of paper that a man had paid someone to write, casual as a business expense, because he'd believed she was a woman alone with no options and no one standing behind her. She had been alone. She wasn't anymore. Ethan sat down beside her. He didn't say anything. He just sat there close enough that she could feel the solid fact of him in the chair next to hers, and she exhaled one long, slow breath. And when she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her chin was up and her back was straight, and she looked exactly like a woman who has carried something enormous for a very long time and has just been told officially and legally that she can put it down. Judge Calloway looked at Griggs. Griggs looked at his paper case. Calloway's voice when he spoke had lost every remaining trace of its earlier authority. What was left was just a man reading words trying to get through the next 5 minutes without making his situation worse. "The debt claim against the estate of Roy Bennett, he said, "is found to be insufficiently substantiated for collection proceedings." He cleared his throat. "The lien is dismissed." Outside the courthouse in the summer heat, with Main Street going about its business around them, and the mountains standing up clear on 3 sides, Claire Bennett. Claire Walker stood on the steps and looked at the street and said nothing for a long moment. Sutter shook Ethan's hand. Ruth Calloway embraced Claire briefly, fiercely, and walked away without saying anything, which was the most emotional thing Ethan had ever seen Ruth Calloway do. Alderman stood near his borrowed horse with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has set down a weight he's carried so long, He'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. Claire walked over to him. She said something quiet. He nodded. She put her hand out, and he shook it, and she didn't let go right away, and after a moment he covered their clasped hands with his other one briefly, and then they both let go, and he put his hat on and went to his horse. Ethan was standing at the bottom of the steps when Claire came back to him. She stopped in front of him, looked at him directly the way she'd looked at him the first day on the mountain, except that what was in her eyes now was completely different. The assessment was gone. The careful measurement of a stranger. What was there now was something that had been building for 4 days in a working ranch kitchen, and on a fence line, and at a table covered in documents, and in the dark before dawn, with cold coffee and a man who asked about her father. "You didn't have to go to Billings," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't have to stay past the 4 days." "No," he said again. "Why did you—" He looked at her in the summer light on the courthouse steps of a town that had watched her fight for her name and her land, and her father's memory, and had mostly stayed out of it until she'd given them a reason not to. He said, "I think you already know." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted. Not the wall going up, not the controlled expression she'd worn for days. Something opening. Carefully. The way a door opens when the person on the other side of it has decided to trust the knock. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I still have 40 acres to work," she said. "Fence needs finishing. Creek channel needs clearing. Barn roof won't hold another winter without new boards." She paused. "That's a lot for one person." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "It is." "It would be a lot less," she said, "for two." The street went on around them, horses at the rail, someone calling a name down by the hardware store, the ordinary life of a small town continuing as it always did regardless. "I've got 8 cattle and a dog on a mountain," he said. "Bring them down," she said. And something moved in her face, the first real smile he'd seen from her, small and careful and absolutely certain. "We've got room." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll need to go get the dog." She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. It was brief and genuine, and it changed her whole face, and then it settled back into that careful, almost smile that he was beginning to suspect he would spend a considerable amount of time thinking about. "All right," she said, "but come back." "I will," he said, and it was not a polite answer, and it was not a cautious one. It was the kind of answer a man gives when he has already decided down somewhere below words and strategy and 4-day plans that the thing he's been running from for years and the thing he's been running toward have turned out improbably to be the same place. He tipped his hat. She held his eyes, and Charles Whitmore was led out the side door of the courthouse by James Rourke, and 2 men from the commissioner's office, and nobody on Main Street missed him at all. He was gone 3 days. Claire told herself she wasn't counting. She fed the cattle and cleared the silted channel on the creek diversion and replaced 2 of the barn roof boards herself, working from a ladder with a mouthful of nails and a hammer she'd had since she was 12, and she did not look down the south road more than was reasonable for a person who happened to be working near the fence line at regular intervals throughout the day. She was counting. The ranch felt different since the hearing. Not quieter it was, the same sounds, the same work, the same creek running below the south pasture. But the quality of the quiet had changed. Before, the silence had the particular weight of a place that is holding its breath waiting for something bad to arrive. Now it was just silence. Just a ranch in summer with work to be done, and the mountains standing up clean on 3 sides, and nobody with a legal claim trying to take any of it. She'd woken the morning after the hearing, and lain still in the gray light, and waited for the dread to come, that first thing in the morning dread that had been her companion since the day she'd found her father. And it hadn't. What came instead was something cautious and new. A feeling she didn't have a name for, yet something between relief and the particular tenderness of a place that's been bruised and is just beginning to understand it isn't going to be hit again. She got up and made coffee, and there was nobody there to drink it with, and she noticed that too. Sutter came by the second morning with his hand, and they finished the south fence line, and he didn't ask about Ethan, and she didn't explain, and they worked companionably until noon, and then he left, and she was alone again with the cattle and the creek, and her thoughts. Ruth Calloway sent a package via Cooper's Boy, 2 jars of put-up peaches, and a note that said, "The whole town's talking. Most of them are saying the right things now." Funny how that works. R. Claire set the peaches on the shelf next to her father's Bible and read the note twice, and then folded it into the Bible at the page her father had marked last, which was Psalms 46, and she didn't think too hard about why she put it there. On the evening of the second day, James Rourke came back.
Chatuo.
He knocked at the door at 6 o'clock with his hat in his hands and the trail dust still on him, and he was alone this time, without the official bearing of the hearing room. He was, she realized, just a man in his 40s who had been doing a hard job for a long time and was probably tired. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "I apologize for coming without notice. I wanted to speak with you directly before I file my full report." She let him in and gave him coffee and sat across from him at the table that had seen more significant conversations in the past week than in the previous 10 years combined. "Whitmore's been taken to Helena," Rourke said. "The commissioner's office will hold him pending a territorial grand jury. Griggs turned over 3 days ago complete cooperation in exchange for reduced charges." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "The forged documents cover 7 properties across 2 counties. Roy Bennett's was the 8th attempt. You stopped it before it completed." Claire was quiet for a moment. "The other 7 families," she said. "3 of them have grounds to recover their land," Rourke said. "The other 4, the sales were too long ago, too legally complicated. But there will be financial remedy hearings. It won't make them whole, but it won't be nothing." He paused. "Alderman is one of the 3. Something moved through Claire's chest, sharp and warm at once. "Frank can go home, if he wants to," Rourke said. "The original sale will be set aside as fraudulently induced. His property claim is restored pending the court's formal order, which will take a few months, but the outcome is not in doubt." She thought about Frank Alderman loading sacks in a Billings warehouse with his flat-stopped eyes. Going home. "There's something else," Rourke said. He set his cup down and looked at her directly. "I want to tell you that your husband's role in this going to Billings bringing Alderman back the document comparison he prepared, that was not a small thing. We had the case, we had 4 months of work, but we needed a living plaintiff to trigger the hearing. Without you filing and fighting, we could not have moved." He paused. "Without him supporting you, I don't know that you would have had the pieces in place in time." Claire looked at the table for a moment. "He'd say he was just doing what needed doing," she said. "Most good men do," Rourke said. After he left, she stood on the porch in the evening warmth and looked down the south road, and this time she didn't pretend she wasn't looking. He came back the 3rd morning at 7:30. She heard Colt before she saw him that particular rhythm on the South Trail that she'd already learned without realizing she'd learned it, and she was in the barn when she heard it, and she made herself finish what she was doing, which was checking the water level in the trough before she came out. He came through the gate with Colt and 6 of his cattle and a dog. The dog was enormous. Some kind of shepherd mix, gray and brown, with ears that couldn't decide whether to stand up or fold over, and had compromised by doing one of each. He was running the cattle with the easy professional authority of an animal who knows his job and enjoys it, pushing the strays back to the group with quick, decisive movements and no wasted energy. Ethan pulled Colt up in the yard and looked at her. "You moved the fence line," he said. "We finished it," she said. "Sutter helped." "South section, too." "All of it." He looked at the fence for a moment, and she could see something in his face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the look of a man updating his understanding of what he's come back to. "Rourke came," she said. "I know. Passed him on the road." He swung down from Colt. "He tell you about Alderman?" "Yes." She looked at the dog, who had settled the cattle efficiently, and was now sitting in the middle of the yard looking at her with calm, assessing eyes. "What's his name?" "Dog," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I know," he said. "You named your dog Dog." "He answers to it." Ethan said with the particular defensive dignity of a man who knows he's lost this argument before it started. She looked back at the dog. The dog looked back at her with the expression of an animal that is fully aware it has been living beneath its naming potential and has made peace with it. "Come here," she said. The dog came immediately, sat in front of her, and put one large paw on her boot. She looked at Ethan. "He's smarter than you." "Yes," Ethan said. "He is." Something between them shifted then. Not dramatically, not the way things shifted in the hearing room, with federal badges and forged signatures and 3 people standing up to tell the truth. Just quietly. The way things shift between 2 people when the emergency is over and the ordinary begins, and the ordinary turns out to be not so different from what they'd been doing all along, just without the deadline. "Your cattle need water," she said. "Troughs full. Put them in the east pasture, the gate's open." "All right," he said. "And there's coffee on the stove." "I know," he said. "You said there would be." No. They fell into the work of the ranch the way 2 people fall into it, when they've each been doing it alone for years, and the habits of one fit into the gaps of the other without requiring negotiation. He was up before her in the mornings. She was better at the cattle records. He fixed things without being asked the barn door hinge that had been stiff all summer. The loose board on the porch step, a section of the diversion channel she hadn't gotten to yet. She cooked because she was better at it, and he ate without comment, except the first time she made her father's recipe for beef stew, when he stopped after the first bite and looked at his bowl and said quietly, "That's real good," in a tone that meant more than the words. They talked. Not all the time. Neither of them were people who needed to fill silence, but in the evenings at the table, and on the fence line in the mornings, and occasionally in the barn. When the work ran slow, they talked in the way that builds something. She told him about growing up on this land. The summer she was 14, and a flash flood took out the south fence, and she and her father spent 3 days rebuilding it in the mud. The winter her father traded 2 cattle for a mare that turned out to be the best horse he ever owned. The way he'd taught her to read water rights documents, the same patient way he'd taught her to read anything. Sit with it, ask questions. Don't pretend to understand what you don't. He told her about the years before the mountain. Wyoming, Colorado, the drifting life of a hired hand that had suited him when he was young and had worn thin as he got older without his quite noticing, like a coat that fits perfectly. Until one morning you put it on and realize it hasn't fit for a year. He told her about the winter in the trapper's lean-to north of Missoula that he thought was rock bottom, and turned out to be the thing that made him buy his 60 acres with the money he'd saved over 4 years of not spending on anything. He told her about the first morning he'd woken up on his own land, and what that had felt like, not happy exactly. Settled, like a compass finding north. "Did it stay that way?" she said. They were at the table, the evening lamp between them, the dog asleep under her chair, with his head on her foot. "Mostly," he said. "Sometimes it got quiet in the wrong way. Not peaceful. Just empty." He looked at his hands. "I got used to it." "You shouldn't have to get used to empty," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the lamp, and her face had the particular quality of someone who has said a true thing without calculating at first. "No," he said. "You shouldn't." She looked up at him then, and they held each other's eyes across Roy Bennett's table, and the thing that had been building since the first day since a woman rode up a mountain trail with blood on her hands and said, "Marry me." And a man who had no reason to say yes said yes anyway, was right there between them, patient and undeniable, and neither of them quite ready to name it yet. Then the dog shifted under her chair and stepped on her foot, and she winced and looked down and said, "Dog," in an exasperated tone, and the moment broke clean, and they both let it go, and that was all right too, because it would come back. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It came through Cooper's boy, as things often did. Now the livery had become an informal postal relay for the Bennett Ranch since the hearing, because Cooper had decided whose side he was on and acted accordingly. Claire was at the creek when the boy came, and Ethan took the letter and looked at the return address and went to find her. She was knee-deep in the water clearing the last section of the diversion channel with a flat shovel. She looked up when she heard him on the bank. He held up the envelope. She looked at the return address, looked at him, came out of the water. The letter was from the Territorial Commissioner's office. 2 pages official letterhead, dense with legal language, that resolved when you cut through it to a single fact: the federal fraud case against Charles Whitmore had been formally opened. A grand jury had been convened in Helena. Griggs's full testimony had been entered into the record, and attached to the letter was a separate single-page document, a certified copy of a court order confirming the legal validity of all property holdings currently contested in the case, including the 40-acre Bennett homestead claim on the South Fork of Redstone Creek. It was over. Not the trial that would take months, but the threat. The thing that had been hanging over this land since the week after Roy Bennett's funeral was legally, permanently, officially gone. No lien, no contest, no Whitmore's men on the South Road counting fence posts. Claire read the letter twice, standing on the creek bank with her boots wet and the shovel in her other hand and the water running behind her. Then she folded it very carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the mountains. Ethan stood beside her and didn't say anything. "My father filed this claim in 1871, she said. "He was 22 years old. He came out here with $40 and a mule, and he spent 6 months building the house before he went back east to marry my mother." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it deep and moving. "He used to say this valley chose him, not the other way around." She stopped. Her jaw worked once. "He would have liked to see this letter." "He knew you'd fight for it," Ethan said. "He knew I'd try," she said. "He didn't know I'd have help." She looked at him sideways. "I didn't either," she said quietly. "When I rode up that mountain, I thought maybe you'd say yes out of decency, and you'd stand next to me for 4 days, and then go back to your life, and I'd be grateful and alone again, and that would have to be enough." She looked at the letter in her hands. "I didn't think—" She stopped. "What?" he said. She turned and looked at him fully. Out here in the daylight, with the creek behind her and the mountains above and the summer heat and her wet boots, she looked exactly like herself. No more and no less, and that was not a small thing. "I didn't think it would matter," she said. "You, being here." She paused. "I didn't let myself think it would matter, because I've been not letting myself think things for 6 years. Since my mother died, I took care of my father, and since my father died, I took care of this place, and I got very good at knowing what I needed and not thinking too hard about what I wanted." "Claire," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. "Not sharp, just honest. What I want is for you to stay, not as a legal arrangement, not as a business partner, not because we've already signed a paper and the commissioner's office has confirmed it." She held his eyes. "Because you set down your axe on a mountain 12 miles from town and listened to a woman you didn't know and said yes for the right reasons. And then you went to Billings and you came back. And every morning you've been here, the stove is warm when I come down. And that is—" Her voice went rough at the edge. "That is not a small thing, Ethan. That is not a small thing to me." He was quiet for a moment. The creek ran behind her. The dog had followed them down from the house and was sitting on the bank upstream, watching them with his ears at different angles. "I left my mountain," Ethan said, "because a woman needed help and I had help to give. I stayed because—" He stopped, looked at her. Something moved through his face that was unfamiliar on it, not because it was foreign to him, but because he'd kept it under wraps for so long that it had forgotten it had a face. "Because every day I stayed, the place made more sense than the day before. Because you make sense to me. The way you work, and the way you think, and the way you told Whitmore's errand boy your name without blinking. The way you sat across from me in the dark before the hearing and talked about your father." He paused. "I haven't made sense of a place or a person in a long time. I wasn't sure I still knew how." She looked at him. "Stay," she said. "I already brought my cattle," he said. Something broke in her face then, not into sadness, into the opposite, into the kind of openness that only happens when a person has been closed for a very long time and chooses finally to stop. She laughed, brief and genuine, and her eyes were bright with it, and she reached out and put her hand on his chest, not reaching for anything, just placing it there over his heart, feeling the solid fact of him. He put his hand over hers. They stood there by the creek on Roy Bennett's land, with the summer heat all around them, and the mountains, and the dog watching from upstream, with both ears, finally for once, standing up straight. They told nobody and everybody found out anyway. That was the nature of Ridgeline. Ruth Calloway knew by Thursday, which meant by Friday, it was general knowledge, which meant that on Saturday, when they rode into town for supplies, the quality of the air on Main Street was different. Not universally warm, there were people who looked away, and people whose expressions were complicated by the memory of which side they'd been on. But there were enough who nodded, who said good morning, who stepped aside on the boardwalk, with the particular deliberate courtesy of people making a point enough of them that it meant something. Ferris, coming out of the county building, stopped and actually removed his hat. "Mrs. Walker," he said. "Mr. Walker." "Mr. Ferris?" Claire said. He held his hat in his hands, in almost exactly the way Sutter had held his weeks ago. "I want to say what I did sending word through Cooper when Griggs came in. It wasn't much. But I want you to know it was deliberate." "It mattered," Claire said. "It was the right thing." He put his hat back on and nodded, and went on his way, with the expression of a man who has been carrying a small weight and has been told he can set it down. In the general store, Ruth Calloway charged them exactly what things cost, and not a penny less and a penny more, which from Ruth was the purest form of respect she knew how to give. "Your roof boards," she said to Ethan as she wrapped the order. "I've got a better grade of timber coming in next week. You should wait for it." "How'd you know about the roof?" he said. Ruth looked at him over her spectacles with the expression of a woman who has operated a general store in a small town for 30 years and considers this question beneath her. "Is there anything in this county I don't know about?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Correct," she said. Outside with the supplies loaded, Claire stood by the horses and looked down the street at Ridgeline, at its 4 blocks, and its 1,100 people, and its long memory and its slow, grudging real-time reckoning with who it had been and who it might yet be. "Are you all right?" Ethan said. "I grew up here," she said. "I know every person on this street. Some of them I've been angry at for weeks." She paused. "I'm trying to figure out if I can let that go." "Can you?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "Most of them were afraid," she said. "Fear makes cowards of ordinary people. I know that." She looked at him. "I don't know if knowing it makes it easier to forgive." "Probably not," he said. "But it makes it possible." She nodded, filed that away with the same deliberateness she filed everything. "Let's go home," she said, and they rode out of Ridgeline together in the afternoon light back down the valley road toward the South Fork and 40 acres, and the creek that ran clean all summer, and the word home sat in the air between them, and neither of them felt the need to comment on it, because it had simply become the true thing. The way true things become true, not all at once, not with a declaration, but by accumulation, day after working day, morning after morning, with the stove warm and the coffee ready, and a man's axe leaning against a fence post, and a woman's notebook open on the kitchen table, each of them filling in the spaces, the other one left until the spaces were gone, and what remained was just the shape of a life that fit. Chasanti. The twist came on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after the hearing quiet, as a stone dropping into water. Ethan came in from the barn, and found Claire sitting at the table, with a letter she hadn't told him was coming. She looked up when he came in, and her face had the particular quality of someone who has just read something that has changed the shape of what they thought they knew. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She slid the letter across the table. It was from a law firm in Helena, not Griggs's firm, a different one, reputable, the kind that handles estates. The letter informed Claire Walker née Bennett that in connection with the ongoing fraud proceedings against Charles Whitmore, a review of disputed land transactions had uncovered a previously unknown codicil to the will of one Robert Whitmore, Charles Whitmore's father, filed in 1869 and subsequently suppressed. The codicil concerned a piece of land on the North Fork of Redstone Creek. 80 acres, twice the size of the Bennett Ranch, legally adjacent. And according to the codicil, the land had been promised to Roy Bennett in payment of a debt of honor, a debt Robert Whitmore had recorded in his own hand and witnessed by two men who were still living dating from 1868 before either man had settled in the valley. The court reviewing the codicil in the context of the fraud case had determined that the land rightfully passed to Roy Bennett's estate, to his heir, to Claire. She watched him read it. "My father never told me," she said when he looked up. "I don't know if he knew. I don't know if Robert Whitmore ever told him the debt existed in writing, or if my father just—" She stopped. "He mentioned once years ago that he'd done a man a good turn early on, and the man had offered him payment, and he'd said no. I thought he was just telling me a story about generosity." Her voice had gone soft with something that was grief and wonder wound together. "He didn't know. He turned down what he was owed because that's who he was, and he never knew there was a written record." Ethan looked at the letter, at the legal description of 80 acres on the North Fork, at Roy Bennett's name handwritten in a codicil from 1869 by a man who had owed him something and had the integrity to record it. 80 acres, he said. "On the North Fork," she said. "It runs directly into my pasture. Into our pasture." He looked at her. She looked back at him with her eyes very clear and very bright, and something in her face that was her father's honesty and her own courage, and something new that hadn't been there before this month. Something that had grown in the specific weather of 4 days, that became 3 weeks, that felt like the beginning of the rest of everything. "That's a real ranch," she said. 120 acres with creek access on 2 sides. We could run 40 head. We could build something real, not just hold on, actually build." We. She'd said we, and she hadn't flinched at it, and neither had he. "Your father did a man a good turn," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "And the good turn came back. 40 years later," she said, "through a fraud investigation." Her mouth tilted slightly at the corner. He would have appreciated the irony. Ethan looked at the letter one more time. "Roy Bennett," he said quietly to no one in particular, "to the letter to the kitchen, to whatever it is you address, when you want to acknowledge a man you never met but have come to know through the shape of the life he built and the daughter he raised. You were a good man." Claire's breath caught. Just once. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back down, and her eyes were wet, but she didn't apologize for it. "Yes," she said. He was. Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. Outside the window, the summer was still going strong, all heat and long light, and the sound of the creek running clean over stones, and the dog was asleep on the porch, and the cattle were settled in the east pasture. 8 of hers and 6 of his, grazing together, the way things graze when they've been in the same field long enough to stop making distinctions. The 80 acres on the North Fork didn't come easy. Nothing worth having ever did, and Claire knew that better than most. The codicil had been filed, and the court order had been issued, and the legal claim was uncontested. But uncontested didn't mean uncomplicated. There were surveys to be done, and boundary stakes to be set, and 3 months of paperwork that moved through the territorial system at the particular speed of institutions that are not in a hurry because nobody has threatened them with a Friday deadline. Ethan handled most of it. He rode to Helena twice, sat in waiting rooms, spoke to clerks and commissioners, and one territorial judge who looked at him over his spectacles and said, "You're the man who brought Alderman back," not as a question, and then processed the paperwork in 4 days, instead of the usual 6 weeks, which was how things worked when a person had done something that mattered to the right people. Claire stayed on the ranch and worked it and managed the cattle and cleared the north fence line in preparation for the expansion, and every evening when he came back, she had food on the table and the day's accounting in her notebook and a list of what needed doing tomorrow, and he ate and listened and asked questions, and they talked until the lamp burned low. This was their life. It had assembled itself without announcement. She noticed it on a Tuesday morning in late August. Noticed it the way you notice something that's been true for a while, and you've just caught up to it when she came down to find him already at the stove, his back to her, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man in a space he has claimed, and dog at his feet, waiting with professional patience for anything that might fall. And the coffee ready, and 2 cups set out, and the window showing the first gold light of an early morning. And she stood in the doorway and thought, this is what it looks like, this exact thing. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. She sat down, and he set the cup in front of her and sat across from her, and they looked at each other in the early light, and something passed between them that was both very simple and the most complex thing either of them had been party to in a long time. North Pasture Boundary Stakes came in, he said. I saw them in the barn, she said. Cooper's boy brought them yesterday. We can set them Saturday if the weather holds. It'll hold, she said. Sutter said his barometer's been steady all week. He nodded. She drank her coffee. This was the thing. The letter from Helena came on a Friday. Not from the commissioner's office, this time from the territorial court directly, and it was addressed to both of them. Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Walker, which was the first time Claire had seen their names written together on something official that wasn't a marriage license filed under emergency circumstances, and the sight of it did something to her she hadn't expected. Ethan was in the south pasture when the letter came. She opened it at the table and read it, and then read it again, and then she set it down and sat very still for a moment. The letter confirmed the final transfer of the North Fork parcel. 120 acres total legally consolidated under the Walker name. But that wasn't what made her sit still. What made her sit still was the second paragraph, which informed her that as part of the final resolution of the Whitmore fraud case, the territorial court had reviewed all documentation related to the contested Bennett property and had issued a formal declaration, a legal record, entered permanently into the territorial archives that Roy Bennett had been a man of documented good character and honest dealings, and that the debt claimed against his estate had been proven fraudulent in full. His name, her father's name, cleared, in writing, in the permanent record of the territory he'd spent his life building something honest in. She was still sitting there when Ethan came in. He saw her face before she said a word. He sat down. She slid the letter across. He read it. She watched his face as he did the particular stillness of a man reading something important, the slight movement in his jaw at the second paragraph. He set it down. Your father's name, he said. Yes, she said. In the permanent record. Yes. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and she felt it. Then the full weight of the last 4 months from the morning she'd found her father cold in his bed, to the mountain road to Billings, to the hearing room, to this kitchen table, all of it compressing into this single moment, and she didn't try to hold it back. Her eyes filled and she let them. She didn't look away. He deserved that, she said. Her voice was rough at the edges. He deserved to have someone say it out loud, in a document, somewhere it can't be taken back. Yes, Ethan said. He did. He reached across the table. Not for the letter, for her hand. He wrapped both his hands around hers and held it the way you hold something you intend to keep, and she felt the solid warmth of it and didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. They set the north boundary stakes on Saturday as planned. All day working across the new ground that had been Bennett ground in a document filed in 1869 and had spent 40 years in the wrong hands and was now coming home. Claire felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not happiness exactly. Deeper than that. The particular settledness of a person who has fought for a true thing and won it and is now standing on the proof. Ethan worked beside her methodical and sure-driving stakes with the same focused competence he brought to every physical task. Dog ran the perimeter with officious authority, pausing at each stake as though confirming it met his standards. At the northwest corner, where the north fork of the creek came around, and the land opened up into a wide flat meadow, the best ground on the new parcel. She could see it immediately. Good grass, good water, Access, the kind of place that practically called out to be used. Claire stopped and stood. Ethan drove the last stake and straightened up and looked at where she was looking. "That's good ground," he said. "It's extraordinary ground," she said. "My father saw this parcel once. I was 12. We rode up here on a Sunday. It belonged to a widow then, who was trying to sell, and my father couldn't afford it. And he knew he couldn't afford it, and he still rode up here just to see it." She looked at the meadow. "He stood right about here. He didn't say anything for a long time, and then he said someday someone's going to do something real with this. And then we rode home." Ethan stood beside her and looked at the meadow and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "What do you want to do with it?" She turned and looked at him. The question was real, not rhetorical, not leading anywhere, just a genuine open question from a man who wanted to know her answer. "Run cattle on the flat," she said. "Extend the creek channel to the east end so the whole meadow gets water. Build a proper hay barn at the north end, not the patch and pray structure we've got, now a real one." She paused. "And eventually, not yet, but eventually I'd like to build a bigger house." He looked at her. "The house we have is fine," she said quickly. I know what you mean," he said. "Eventually." She held his eyes. "Yes," she said. "Then that's the plan," he said. She nodded. And that was the whole conversation, and it contained everything it needed to. The grand jury met in Helena in September. Ethan went. Claire stayed on the ranch. They'd discussed it and agreed that someone needed to be there and that someone should be him because she was needed for the cattle rotation, and because both of them knew that she'd spent 4 months fighting a legal battle, and it was now legally in other hands, and she was allowed to let it be in other hands. He was gone 5 days. She did not count them any differently than she'd counted the 3 days he'd gone to fetch his cattle. But the ranch was very quiet, and Dog slept outside her bedroom door every night like he was maintaining a post, and she found herself talking to the cattle more than was strictly necessary, which her father had always done too, and which she had always found both endearing and slightly worrying in him, and which she now understood completely. He came back on a Thursday evening with a telegram from Rourke that said Whitmore had entered a guilty plea to 14 counts of fraud, attempted extortion, and conspiracy to commit property theft. He would not be returning to Ridgeline County. Claire was in the kitchen when Ethan came in and handed her the telegram. She read it again, set it on the table next to the letter with her father's name in it, the 2 pieces of paper side by side. Then she stood up and walked to Ethan and, without preliminary or explanation, put her arms around him. He went still for a moment, just a moment, the brief hesitation of a man recalibrating, and then he put his arms around her and held on. She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. She didn't cry. She'd already done her crying in private in the early mornings before he woke up in the minutes, when the relief had come in waves and she'd let it. What she felt now was different, solid, like the last stone being set in a wall that had been building for months. "It's done," she said into his shoulder. "It's done," he said. She pulled back and looked at him. Up close like this, with his arms still loosely around her, she could see everything that 4 months of working beside him had put in his face. The additional lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting in summer light, the fading bruise on his jaw from the fence post accident 3 weeks ago that he'd been annoyed about because it looked more dramatic than it felt, the particular way he looked at her that was different from every other way he looked at anything that had been different for weeks, and neither of them had named directly. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I rode up that mountain because I had no choice," she said. "I asked you to marry me because the law required a husband, and you were the only honest man I could get to in time." She held his eyes. "That's how it started. I need you to know that I know that." "I know it too," he said. "But that's not what it is now," she said. He looked at her. The kitchen was quiet around them. Dog had come in from the porch and was sitting by the stove watching them with his mismatched ears in their usual state of indecision. "No," Ethan said. "It's not." "What is it now?" she said. She wasn't being coy. She was asking the way she asked everything directly, wanting a real answer, willing to sit in the discomfort of the question until it got one. He looked at her for a long moment. "It's the stove being warm in the morning," he said. "It's knowing what you're going to ask before you ask it, and having the answer ready. It's the way you talk to the cattle when you think nobody's listening." A pause. "It's the North Fork meadow and what you want to build there. It's your father's Bible on the shelf, and the peaches Ruth sent, and the notebook in your apron pocket." He stopped. His voice had gone quieter. "It's every single day I've been here. All of them. I wouldn't trade one." She looked at him with her eyes bright and her chin steady. "Ethan Walker," she said. "Claire Walker," he said. "That's the first time you've called me that," she said. "Is it all right?" he said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw carefully over the fading bruise and looked at him like she was making sure of something she had already decided, and then she said, "I want a real marriage, not the paper kind, the kind where you mean it." "I already mean it," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to say it anyway, out loud, to you." He put his hand over hers on his jaw and turned his face slightly and pressed his lips to her palm. And that was his answer, and it was enough, and it was everything. The second ceremony was nothing like the first. There was no county clerk, no justice of the peace, with a large mustache, no witnesses required by legal necessity. It happened on a Sunday morning in October, when the summer heat had finally broken and the air had the particular clarity of a Montana fall, sharp and clean and honest. Ruth Calloway came. Dale Sutter came. Frank Alderman came. Frank Alderman, who had gone home to his land on the South Fork, who had spent September with his wife, walking his own ground again, and had arrived at the Bennett Ranch that Sunday with a face that had found its way back to itself. The flatness gone, something inhabiting his eyes again that looked like a man who has remembered who he is. James Rourke sent a letter that arrived the day before, which said in its entirety, "I hope it takes. You both earned it." Rourke. They stood in the south pasture where the creek ran below, and the mountains stood up on three sides, and the sky was that impossible Montana blue, and a traveling minister who knew Ruth Calloway said the words, and this time when he said the word husband, Claire's voice didn't catch. She said it clean and clear, and like she meant it. Ethan said his words looking at her directly, without looking away once, and everyone who was there said afterward separately, without coordinating, that they had never seen a man look at a woman quite like that. Not with longing or performance. With recognition. The way you look at something you have been moving toward for years, without knowing it, and have finally arrived. When it was done, Ruth Calloway produced a cake from somewhere. Ruth Calloway always produced things from somewhere. It was one of her defining characteristics. And Sutter opened a bottle of something that he described as whiskey in the loose definitional sense. And Alderman sat on the fence rail and talked to Ethan for an hour about cattle rotation on the North Fork, while their wives stood together near the creek. Claire stood beside Ruth and watched the men talk and felt the warmth of the October sun and thought about her father. She thought about him the way she'd been learning to think about him, not in the sharp, ambushing grief of the first weeks, but with a fuller feeling, something that had room in it for gratitude. He'd built this land. He'd raised her to know it and love it and fight for it. He'd shaken a stranger's hand at a cattle auction in 1882 with the grip of a man who meant what he said, and that stranger's son had driven 3 days to Billings and back and set fence stakes in October sunlight and said every single day like he meant it. Roy Bennett had built a life so honest that even its debts came back good. "You're thinking about your father," Ruth said. "Yes," Claire said. "He'd be insufferably smug about all this," Ruth said. "You know that." Claire laughed full and real. "Yes," she said. "He absolutely would." Ruth put her arm through Claire's, and they stood there together and watched the men and the dog and the cattle and the good ground, and it was a fine thing, and it was enough, and it was real.
Datan.
That evening, after everyone had gone and the dishes were done, and Dog was asleep under the table, Ethan came and stood behind Claire, where she was looking out the window at the last light on the mountains, and he put his hands on her shoulders. "Tell me something," he said. "What do you want to know?" she said. "The day you rode up that mountain," he said. "When you were coming up the switchbacks, and you didn't know if I'd say yes or laugh or send you back down. What were you thinking?" She was quiet for a moment. The last light was going off the peaks, going pink and then deep purple. "I was thinking that I was going to ask a stranger to save my father's land," she said, "and that it was either the smartest thing I'd ever done or the most desperate." She paused. "And I was thinking that whatever happened, at least I hadn't stopped. At least I'd ridden every road I had before I gave up." He was quiet behind her. "And when I came around the bend and saw you," she said, "standing there with your axe and your hat, and your horse with his ears up, looking at me like I was something between a problem and a phenomenon." She felt him almost laugh at that, the slight movement of it. "I thought, there he is. That's the man." She turned around. "I didn't know what I meant by it. I know now." He looked at her in the last light coming through the window. "There she is," he said. "That's what I thought too. Standing at my fence watching you come down from that mare with blood on your hands and your chin up like the world owed you an apology." He touched her face. "I thought, whoever this woman is, she is not going to be told no by anything as small as a crooked land baron." "And yet you still made me ask twice," she said. "I made you come inside," he said. "That's different." "Barely," she said. He smiled, then full and real, the smile she'd been collecting like evidence since the first time she'd seen it, rare and worth waiting for, the smile of a man who has stopped saving himself for somewhere better, and has decided that this is the place. She put her hand on his chest over his heart, the way she'd done that day by the creek. He put his hand over hers. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I should have said it sooner. I kept waiting until it felt like the right time. And then I realized there isn't a right time. There's just time. And I've been wasting some of it." She waited. "I love you," he said. "Not the paper kind, and not the arrangement kind, and not the I owe you because you needed help kind." His voice was steady, and his eyes were direct, and he said it the way he said everything that mattered, without flourish, without armor, exactly as true as it was. The real kind. The every morning kind. The kind your father and mother had when he rode back east to marry her after 6 months alone, building a house in a valley that had chosen him. He paused. That kind. She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were very bright. "Ethan Walker," she said, "you picked the most unfair possible moment to say something like that." "Why?" he said. "Because now I'm going to cry," she said. "And I have been so careful not to cry in front of you for 4 months." "You can cry in front of me," he said. "I know," she said. And she did, just briefly, just a few tears that she didn't hide and didn't apologize for. And he held her through it with the same steadiness he brought to every hard thing. And when it passed, she pulled back and looked at him with her eyes red at the rims, and her chin up and her whole face open. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while. Since Billings, I think. Since you went and came back." She paused. "A man who goes and comes back is everything, Ethan. Do you understand that a man who says he'll be somewhere, and then he's there, that is the whole thing? That's what I needed my whole life and didn't know I could ask for." He pulled her close and held her, and she let herself be held. And outside the window, the last light left the mountains and the stars came out over Montana, thick and clear and very close. The way they only get far from city lights, and the creek ran below the south pasture, and the cattle settled in the dark, and dogs shifted under the table, and sighed with the profound satisfaction of an animal whose world is in correct order. They built the hay barn the following spring. It took 6 weeks with Sutter's help and 2 hired hands who'd come down from the Billings hiring post, and it went up on the North Fork meadow, exactly where Claire had planned it, solid and true. The kind of structure that says something about the people who built it, that they expected to be there for a long time, that they were not making temporary arrangements. Frank Alderman came for a weekend in June and brought his wife, a quiet woman named Edith, who had strong opinions about cattle breeding and expressed them freely, and was immediately and thoroughly liked by Claire, who had the same quality. The four of them ate dinner at the extended kitchen table and talked until late, and afterward, Ethan and Frank sat on the porch in the dark and didn't say much and didn't need to. "You doing all right?" Ethan said. "Better than all right," Frank said. "My wife cried when we came back to the land. Just stood in the yard and cried." He paused. "I wasn't far behind her." "Good," Ethan said. "Yeah," Frank said. The dog sat between them, and they all three looked at the stars. By August, the cattle herd had grown to 34 head. The North Fork pasture was everything Claire had said it would be. The creek extension worked, and the grass came in thick, and the whole operation had a scale and solidity it hadn't had before. She kept the books in a proper ledger now, not just the notebook in her apron pocket, though she still kept that too-old habit. Her father's habit, the habit of a person who knows that you carry the important things close. Ethan rode the fence line every morning the way she'd ridden it alone for 2 years before him. And the fact that she could see him out there from the kitchen window when she came down in the mornings. That particular shape of a man on a horse, checking that everything was where it should be, did something to her chest, every single time, without growing ordinary, without losing its weight. She told him this once, on an evening when they were sitting on the porch after a long day. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I see you in the creek channel on Tuesday mornings getting your boots wet for the sake of a diversion flow that could wait a week. I've seen it every Tuesday for a year. It doesn't get ordinary." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Dog was on the step below them, watching the south road with professional attention. "My father used to sit here," she said. "On this step, in the evenings." "I know," he said. "You told me." "He'd have liked this," she said. "All of it." "I think he planned it," Ethan said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "Not deliberately," Ethan said. "But a man who builds a life as honest as he built raises a woman who rides to a stranger's mountain and says what she needs instead of giving up. And a man who shakes hands clean at a cattle auction leaves a kind of mark in the world." He paused. "I think we're living in the middle of everything he started." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she settled her head back against his shoulder. "Yes," she said. "I think we are." The summer evening settled around them warm and wide, and full of the ordinary sounds of a working ranch at rest. And above the valley, the first stars appeared one by one in the deep Montana sky. And Roy Bennett's land, all 120 acres of it, creek-fed and well-staked, and registered in the permanent territorial record, under the name of people who had earned it, and intended to keep it breathed in the quiet dark like something alive. The man who had spent a decade running from the world had found the one piece of it worth staying for. The woman who had carried everything alone had learned that carrying together wasn't weakness, it was the whole point. And the life they were building one honest day at a time on ground that had been fought for and won and properly named was not a compromise or a convenience or an arrangement of necessity grown comfortable. It was a choice, made every single morning, by two people who had looked at each other clearly in full knowledge of who they were and what it would cost and said yes. This, you. That was the whole story. That was enough. That was everything.